When we last left off our story, the Phoenix Suns had just completed a surprise run to the 1976 NBA Finals. And while they did end up losing to the Celtics in 6 games that year, that run would establish the team on the national level and build a large and loyal fan base for the team in the Valley. With the finals appearance now under their belt, the Suns had a lot of high expectations placed upon them heading toward the 1980s. With one of the league's most talented rosters and one of the best coaches in the NBA, the fans fully expected a title to be brought home to Phoenix within the next decade. However, while there were plenty of successes to celebrate during this time, the 1980s would end up being a mixed bag for Arizona sports fans. One filled with new disappointments, new stars, new scandals, new owners, and eventually a whole new team to root for. Welcome to Arizona's crazy 1980s. Welcome to the Valley. In the year after their shocking NBA Finals appearance, the Suns would take a step backward in '77 and miss the playoffs entirely. However, this setback wouldn't last for very long. The 1977-78 season would mark the beginning of the first great Phoenix Suns team, as that year would contain the first of 8 straight playoff appearances for the franchise. With many of the original stars of the franchise like Dick Van Arsdale and Connie Hawkins now either retired or moved on to other teams, this era of Suns basketball was mostly led by 5 main guys, 3 of which we've talked about already, and 2 of which we haven't met yet. The tone for this team was set by head coach John McCloud, who had taken everything he had learned from his years as a college coach and his early years of coaching the Suns and turned those lessons into a winning culture around the ball club. The result of which was a team that averaged over 48 wins a season over 8 full seasons. Center Alvin Adams would never again reach the level of success he had in his first season in the NBA. But despite that, he still established himself as one of the most consistently effective players in the league, and one of the cornerstones of the Suns franchise. During the peak of his career, he would average around 15 points, 8 rebounds, and 5 assists per game. And unlike many of the players that would call the Valley home over the years, he would spend his entire 13-year career in Phoenix, with most of it coming during this stretch, more than earning a reputation as one of the most beloved athletes in Arizona sports history. In contrast, while Paul Westphal may not have spent as much time in Phoenix as Adams did, his time in Phoenix is remembered almost as fondly. Ever since coming to Phoenix in 1975, Westphal had been a superstar in the Valley, averaging over 20 points a game in every single season he was with the Suns. And from 1976 till he left in 1980, he would make 4 straight All-Star games representing Phoenix, in a career that would eventually see him elected to the National Basketball Hall of Fame. Joining those 3 was a young player by the name of Walter Davis, whom the Suns selected 5th overall in the 1977 draft. Quickly, he made a name for himself for his smooth stroke and his volume scoring, earning many nicknames including Sweet D, the Candyman, and the Man with the Velvet Touch. Like Adams, Davis would spend his first 11 seasons in Phoenix, and he would become one of the other cornerstones of the franchise, consistently leading the team in scoring and making 6 All-Star teams during his time in Phoenix, with 4 of those coming during his first 4 seasons. And once Westphal left after the end of the 1980 season, his place as one of the pillars of the franchise was quickly replaced by another young player by the name of Larry Nance. After becoming a full-time starter in 1982, Nance quickly established himself as one of the key players on the Phoenix roster, averaging a little under 20 points and 9 rebounds a game during his time in the Valley, and getting named to the 1985 All-Star team. With this collection of talent at their disposal, the Suns would put together one of the best teams in the Western Conference year after year for nearly a decade. However, even though they had the talent on their side, they didn't have the luck to go along with it. Even with the amount of success the Suns had in the regular season, and despite the fact that they had 8 straight playoff appearances to their name, the Suns did not make a single NBA Finals during this run. In fact, they only even went to the Western Conference Finals a total of 2 times during those 8 seasons, losing to the Supersonics in 7 games in 1979 and losing to the Lakers in 6 games in 1984. In other words, for all the success that the Suns had during this run, the decade between 1976 and 1985 would ultimately go down as a failure in the long run for Phoenix, as they never got another chance to avenge their finals loss in 76 and actually bring a title home to Phoenix. But while this run didn't end up with them winning their first title, this run did establish many of the main hallmarks that the Suns franchise would become known for over the years. For one thing, it established a winning culture around the franchise, and a winning expectation among its fans, as this would be the first of 3 long streaks of continued success over the course of the franchise's history. But unfortunately, this also set the precedent of Phoenix always being the bridesmaid but never being the bride, as it seemed like no matter how much talent was on the roster, how good the team was, or how much success they had in the regular season, it always seemed like Phoenix would have something come up either just before or during the playoffs that would completely throw their chances off the rails, forcing them and their fans to wait yet another long season to see if next year will be the one where they finally break through. And it seemed like more often than not, their inevitable playoff collapse would come at the hands of the Los Angeles Lakers, who had eliminated them in 4 of those 8 playoff appearances and had defeated them in all 5 of their playoff series that they had played to that point. But with that being said, this period didn't just bring about disappointments for the Suns and their fans. There were also some good things sprinkled in too, including the introduction of Go the Gorilla in 1980, who became the mascot almost by accident. He attended his first game in 1980 not as a mascot, but as a singing telegram for one of the fans in the stands. But at the encouragement of the other fans in attendance, he ended up making his way down to the edge of the court and started dancing for everyone's entertainment. And to his credit, everyone seemed to love it. So much so that the gorilla eventually started becoming a regular at the arena. From there, it didn't take long for Jerry Colangelo and his marketing department to take notice. And shortly afterward, he offered the gorilla a contract to become the official mascot of the Phoenix Suns, a role in which Go still serves to this day, entertaining all the fans who come through Phoenix Suns Arena. But for the fans who watch the games from home or listen on the radio, they got to listen to the voice of the great Al McCoy, who became the official voice of the Suns in 1972 and is now currently working his 50th straight season in the role, narrating every great Suns team along the way. But the thing about all great teams is that they can only stay great for so long, and at a certain point, all good things have to come to an end. The Phoenix Suns of the 1980s were no different in this regard, but unfortunately for them and their fans, the decline that they saw over the mid to late 1980s would not only be painful to watch on the court, but it would be devastating off the court as well, and its effects would have game-changing effects on the future of the franchise. In 1984, the Suns may have managed to make it all the way to the Western Conference Finals. However, it was becoming increasingly clear that this was not the same Suns team as the ones before them. That year, they would end the regular season at just 41-41, and the season after that, they would make the playoffs despite finishing the regular season at 10 games under 500. By that point, Westphal had been 5 years removed from the team, Adams was starting to see a noticeable decline in his numbers, and many of the team's key role players had started to move on from the franchise. Davis and Nance were still putting up good numbers for the team, but at that point it just wasn't enough to overcome the lack of depth and talent that was still on the roster. They would end their next 3 seasons with 32, 36, and 28 wins respectively, making them among the worst teams in the league. And as you might expect, this caused the front office to start to clean house. Coach McLeod would be fired toward the end of the 1987 season, with Dick Van Arsdale stepping in as interim coach for the rest of that year. Additionally, Adams, Nance, and Davis would all be off the team by the end of the 1988 season. Davis in free agency, Adams in retirement, and Nance by way of a trade. And as if their terrible play on the court wasn't bad enough, the Suns were also dealing with a ton of issues off the court as well. For one thing, the team was dealing with the death of one of their own. In August of 1987, young center Nick Vanos, who was just 24 at the time and entering his third season, was killed in a plane crash on his way back to Phoenix. A loss that dealt a major blow to the locker room. And as if to add insult to injury, the Suns were also dealing with one of the biggest drug scandals in professional sports history at the same time. In April of that year, 13 people were indicted by the Maricopa County Attorney's Office in connection with a drug trafficking ring, a group that included 3 current members of the Phoenix Suns. And to make matters worse, these indictments were made possible through the testimony of Walter Davis, who had already been in rehab once during his career due to drug problems and ended up going back as a result of this investigation. Ultimately, none of the Suns players that were involved ended up standing trial for these indictments. However, in the court of public opinion, the scandal known as Waltergate dealt a massive blow to the Suns' reputation, both on a national level and in the Phoenix community. This reputational damage, alongside terrible play on the court and declining attendance revenue, made the ownership group incredibly nervous, to the point where they started to entertain offers to sell the club to the highest bidder. This would lead to the first relocation crisis in Arizona sports history, as for a time, it seemed like the only groups that were interested in buying the club were only interested for the purpose of moving the team out of state. And for a while, it seemed like this kind of sale was all but guaranteed. But at the very last second, a new group would come in and outbid everyone, one who had every intention of keeping the team right where they were. As you might expect, this group was made up of a hodgepodge of interests from around the valley, from local businesses, to investment groups, to individual investors such as our old friend Van Arsdale. And at the head of all of it was yet another familiar face, Jerry Colangelo. At that time, he was still serving as the general manager of the ball club, but he was feeling increasingly handcuffed by the ownership group, and specifically their perceived disinterest in making any investments or taking any risks. As such, he saw the ongoing ownership crisis as an opportunity to take matters into his own hands, and so he gathered the amount of investors necessary, raised the necessary capital, and bought the team outright for a record $44.5 million, essentially taking full control of the operation in the process. As you might expect, this was a move with massive repercussions for the franchise, and it completely changed the direction of the team heading toward the 1990s, and we'll talk more about why that is later on. However, before we can get into all of that, we must first talk about another team in another league that was dealing with ownership and relocation problems of its own. It's time for us to finally meet the Cardinals. Established in the 1890s, the Cardinals are the longest continuously running football franchise in the history of the game. But unfortunately for them, that's pretty much the only good thing you can say about the team. Since they joined the NFL in 1920, the Cardinals have only managed to win 2 titles in their entire history, the latest of which coming in 1947. And in fact, they spent most of their first 40 seasons in Chicago either at or near the bottom of the league. Eventually, it got to a point where no one in Chicago would bother watching the Cardinals over the crosstown Bears, and they were basically run out of the city. So in 1960, the NFL approved the Bidwell family to move the franchise to St. Louis, mostly as a way to keep the AFL out of that location. But unfortunately, largely due to the Bidwell's mismanagement, the team would face a lot of the same issues in St. Louis that they had in Chicago, namely rampant mediocrity, flagging attendance, and of course, stadium issues. After spending 2 decades playing in either subpar arenas or sharing a baseball stadium, the Bidwells were demanding a state-of-the-art stadium for their team to play in, and of course, they demanded that the city pay for it. As you might imagine, this was a huge reach for the Bidwells. Not just because of the cost of the project, but also because the Cardinals usually ranked around the bottom in attendance, and they had only made the playoffs a total of 3 times since coming to St. Louis, the last of which came almost a decade prior. But even with all of that going against them, an uptick in the team's performance helped get negotiations off the ground towards the middle of the 1980s, and for a while, it seemed like a deal was actually going to get struck. That was, until the team took a sudden downturn, attendance went sour yet again, and the negotiations completely fell through. With the Bidwills being unwilling to budge from their position and the city unwilling to negotiate with them any further, it seemed like an impasse was officially reached, and as such, the Bidwills officially pulled out the nuclear option, and they started the process of relocating the team. Now, despite the historic performance of the team and the demands of the Bidwills, there was still a ton of demand for the team across the country, because frankly, there were a bunch of cities that were just desperate for an NFL franchise. But over the course of a few weeks, Phoenix, Jacksonville, and Baltimore established themselves as the frontrunners. And shortly after the 1987 season, the Bidwills finally made it official, going to the league office, filing the paperwork, and officially announcing that the team would be moving to Phoenix, Arizona the following season. And just like that, Arizona was a multi-sport market. Coming out of the late 1980s, there was a lot of excitement and a lot of uncertainty about the future of Arizona sports. No one knew how the Cardinals were going to do once they made it to the Valley. Similarly, no one knew how Colangelo was going to do as the owner of the Suns, or what direction he was actually going to take the team. But now, looking back in hindsight, there's no uncertainty about it. The craziness of the 1980s may have changed everything about Arizona sports. However, it also paved the way for all of the amazing things that were to come in the 1990s and beyond.